All right, everyone. It looks like we are live. I have Dr. Trent Dougherty with me on the go, as it were. I'm just, before we get into any content, I'm going to make sure that it's live on YouTube before I start mentioning anything. Oh, yep, there we go. All right, so yeah, Dr. Trent Dougherty, his YouTube channel is Recovering Reason. Where else can people find you, Mr. Dougherty?
They can find me at TrentDougherty.com, I believe. I think I've got some of my papers up there. I honestly can't remember. I do need to do an archive of some of my papers, but for the most part, Recovering Reason is it's kind of soft opened um, until I finish a big project that I'm working on, and then I'm hoping to do a bunch of videos, and especially bespoke videos. Like I'm really into like doing videos for specific occasions and even specific people, and expanding my series on Swinburne and my series on kids and theology and kids and philosophy. I've got two young boys. I got one of them right next to me, and they're both super smart, and I love talking philosophy with them. And I know I've heard from a lot of people out there who also love talking philosophy with their kids, but sometimes don't necessarily know how to do that. And since I've done it, for so long, I'm just going to kind of facilitate and do a lot more kids videos.
That's awesome. Yeah. So today we are reviewing the debate that Cosmic Skeptic had with Inspiring Philosophy on Capturing Christianity's channel. And so we're going to play we're going to say the good and bad from what both Mike Jones and Alex O'Connor did, but we're primarily going to be playing clips of Alex speaking. That way we can kind of address those as he goes. So I do have a bunch of meticulous notes here. I have the notes also on my screen that you sent me. So I guess before we start playing it, did you want to give any kind of summary thoughts about the debate?
Yeah. So one is the Cosmic Skeptic guy. He's got a nice voice. he's nice to listen to. Like my buddy Callum Miller. You gotta love. He's like the Hugh Grant of atheists. He's got that sort of charming voice, and at least in this context, where Cameron set it up a little more formally, I think that brought out the best in both of them. Honestly, I think Inspiring Philosophy is typically very well organized and very crisp in its presentation, but maybe a tendency, I think having to do the time limits also helped him be succinct and to the point, and it seemed to me to help Cosmic Skeptic to stick to the point as well. So I'm hoping that Cameron continues to do more videos in this format to kind of evoke a greater sense of seriousness and dialect.
Looks like you froze. So as soon as he is back, guys, he will finish that thought. So yeah, I guess while he's there he is. He's back.
Yeah, I just got home and it switched from LTE to Wi-Fi. So for some reason, every time I do that, it's like it can't make the transition smoothly. It's got to take a little. It's like, hold on a second, we're switching.
Yeah. So I think the last thing you were saying was you wanted Cameron to continue hosting debates with this for more formal format.
Yeah, because for the most part, internet atheists, a-holes, still the method for too long has been, make this about who can make the most clever remarks or something, It's just sort of the nature of the beast. It's just been a habit of it. And so if internet atheists are going to be taken seriously by real thinkers, they're going to have to show this greater discipline. And I think the format will help bring that out. And I do think that my favorite thing about the debate is that look at my dogs. It ended up bringing to light what I think is the single most fundamental issue in the problem of evil, which is axiology. And I can explain this in detail, but everything comes down to what is most valuable. Whether you end up concluding that God exists or doesn't, or the evidence supports theism or not, is all going to be answered by the question, what do you find most valuable? Your answer to that question is going to determine where you land or ought consistently to land with respect to the question of whether there is or is not a God.
Yeah. Personally, and obviously we'll get more into that as we go through the debate. Personally, I have mixed feelings about the format. There are strengths and weaknesses to both. I've seen in the past where if there's no interaction, like at least I think if there's going to be a formal format, that there has to be at least either a Q&A section or a cross-examine section. Because if it's only the formal stuff, I've seen it where that allows one person to completely avoid points being made by the other side because they can never have the person directly ask them to answer it. So it depends too on who it is. Like if it's a guy like Steven Crowder who can politely make his point and control the conversation and then let the other person come back, then I do think there are strengths to that. But I guess it all depends on what the topic is and who the participants are.
Yeah, but if the Q&A, I agree with what you said, but as long as the Q&A is well moderated and comes after the formal debate, it's going to be a lot better. So it's a priming effect, right? It's a typical, cognitive psychology priming effect. If you go through the process of this formal debate, then you are now primed to act more rationally. Whereas I think if you started with the Q&A, it's kind of like, all right, we got no structure. And I think after you've done the structured thing, you got a better chance of maintaining the structure during the process itself, during the Q&A itself.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I guess if it's like Steven Crowder, because he's part of the conversation and he can moderate the conversation and have it be ordered in that way. But if you're kind of hosting two other people that you don't know, then I guess the formal format kind of forces them into that, what you described, basically. So yeah, guys, we are going to get right into this here. I'm going to bring in the debate. We'll play some clips, and then I have certain points written down where I plan to stop so that we can kind of respond to it. But if he says anything and I have to stop and you want to specifically respond to it, you can just tell me to pause it, and I will.
Sounds good.
I clicked on the wrong one.
I want to make the case that, I used to think that the problem of evil was a bad argument on logical grounds because of the fact that there's always logical space for there to be morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering. You can always say that it can't be logically ruled out that there's some reason why God would allow the suffering in the world. I've since changed my mind on this view and become more attracted to the evidential problem than the logical problem of evil. As people grow up, as myself, as I've grown, I become personally acquainted with levels and kinds of suffering that seem to demand a fuller explanation than, well, it's not logically impossible that God would allow this, right? In that capacity, I'm not so much arguing that the presence of suffering should give us reason to think that a loving God cannot exist. I'm not arguing that there's no possible world in which God exists and also evil exists. I prefer to make an evidential case that the sheer level and depth of suffering that exists in the actual world should at least give us major pause. I can't argue that it's impossible that God should allow such suffering, but I can suggest that it appears extremely unlikely. If somebody murdered a close friend of mine in cold blood and stole his wallet right in front of me, I couldn't logically rule out the possibility that my friend was some undercover political saboteur whose assassination prevented him from committing a war crime against the United Kingdom, and there was national security secrets in his wallet, and so the assassin actually did a good thing. Sure, that's not logically impossible. I can't rule that out. But not only would it be difficult to entertain this hypothesis as I watch my friend bleeding out on the floor, I'd also be somewhat troubled by anyone who tried to argue that it might be a good thing that my friend was murdered because of this reason, and that if I want to mourn his sadness, if I want to mourn him in sadness, if I want to say a bad thing, then I'd better be able to demonstrate that his death is logically incompatible with the theory of a benevolent assassin.
All right, so this is the first point I wanted to come to, because already he's making a category error, and I saw Dan Barker make this actually recently in a debate he had, which is confusing two things. Number one, a bad thing happening that can lead to a good thing happening, and a bad thing being actually not being bad but being good in it of itself. And so that's what he's confusing here. If an assassin kills someone who's evil, and you don't know it, well, he's actually doing a good thing. It's not an evil murder in that sense, assuming that there's, say, proper, I don't know, presidential orders or whatever the moral guide to that would have to be. But that's not the same thing. And no one's saying, by the way, that no Christian apologist is saying you're not allowed to mourn a bad thing happening unless you prove on your worldview. That to me, that's just a red herring. But I'll let you take it away.
Why is he watching his friend bleed out, man? Like, staunch that wound, man. Like, don't just stand there, dude. It's like, the best part of that clip was his pronunciation of saboteur. That was my favorite part. But so yes, that there were a couple of different non sequiturs there, and the one that you mentioned, the confusion between an evil event being intrinsically bad, being such that it could be made up for versus not really being bad. Those are just all such different things. And so this is important because later on in the debate, he shows an unfamiliarity with metaethics and seems sort of tone deaf to anything other than a pure utilitarian account. And so right. So you and I both think, given our metaethics, that you could do something that had a good outcome, but was wrong to do, right? And you could do something that had a bad outcome that would be right to do. So suppose you donate money to a charity that turns out to be a fraud. So suppose you donate, I don't know, money to a corporate entity claiming to promote race relations and racial justice, and it turns out they're actually a fascist political front. Just
Right.
to pick an example at random. Well, you've done something that makes the world worse. You've hurt the world. Your action has made the world a worse place. It's got a bad outcome. But the moral quality of the act is judged by what you were aiming at, judged by your intentions. You had, donating the money with the intent of making something better is a good thing. It's a good thing to do. You can't help it if you're hoodwinked and it turns out they're bad. So you can do a good thing that has a bad outcome, and you can do bad things that have good outcomes. Like if somebody would have just wantonly thrown baby Hitler, off a bridge, well, you would have, made the world a drastically better place in the long run. But you didn't know that,
Right.
So you did a bad thing. You did a morally reprehensible thing for which you are fully morally culpable, even though you made the world a better place. So the consequences of an act and the moral quality of the act itself, or the choice, are completely free floating. They come completely apart, and this turns out to be really important later because Cosmic Skeptic just seems tone deaf to the distinction.
Yeah.
I do want to say one other thing real quick about what he said. I do completely. I'm on record in multiple publications as saying that I don't think there is a legitimate distinction between the logical and evidential problems of evil. I don't think there's any.
Okay.
I don't think the real difference between the two. I don't think there's any important difference between the two. But I do agree with him that the thesis that the existence of God and suffering are compossible, metaphysically compossible, doesn't do much. And I think Peter Van Inwagen, I got a couple drafts of a couple different places I criticize Peter Van Inwagen for this because he does something really similar. His arguments usually have the conclusion that because of some story he tells, you don't know that theism is false. That's usually the conclusion. You don't know that theism is false. He'll say that for all you know, this story is true. And if you don't know that story is false, then you don't know that theism's false. Well, what's your standards for knowledge? What probability do you have to have for knowledge? Suppose you think knowledge entails probability of 0.95, that it's that plus whatever else you want it to be. True belief with a 95% evidential probability. Well, then, okay, not knowing that God doesn't exist is consistent with it being 0.9 probable that God doesn't exist. That's a real problem. It's a huge. So yes. So what, Peter? It's like, great. Okay. You don't know that God doesn't exist. That doesn't say much. And it's very disappointing to me that people aim so low.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So let me pull this back up. There we go.
I don't think that would be my burden in that situation. But do bear in mind that I'm using this as an analogy to describe why I bring up, why when you bring up the problem of evil, it's not necessarily a claim of logical inconsistency, but simply to observe that we have some reason to doubt the intentions or existence of an ostensibly loving God, right? I'm not particularly as interested in these cases of seeming moral evil, that is evil that results from human action, although this does require a level of discussion, and it's probably going to be the focal point of our discussion. But the reason why I'm more interested in discussing the problem of suffering rather than the problem of evil per se is that, as Michael points out, many people think it's problematic for an atheist to talk about evil. We can also say that if evil requires evil intention, and we can't know the intentions of someone like God, it becomes difficult to use terms like evil. However, both Christians and atheists can both agree that suffering definitely exists. And if suffering does exist, the point is this: any religion which purports the existence of a loving God must demonstrate why the suffering in the world is justified. Now, the problem is most difficult, I believe, not on the subject of moral evil, but so-called natural evil. That is, evil not caused by free human choice, but rather by earthly events generally referred to, quite unfortunately perhaps for Michael, as acts of God. Earthquakes, tsunamis, natural diseases, these kinds of things. The difficulty for the Christian in cases of such evil is not so much to say that it's justified, but, as Michael kind of implied, to say that this isn't evil at all, because it results from the natural order which God controls, not human action, and therefore must be justifiably inflicted.
Okay, so I do have some thoughts on that, but do you want to lead that one off? Because I know you had sent me some notes on those comments from him.
Yeah, I mean, so like you pointed out, he thinks that, he misunderstands the intent, by attributing to him the idea that he thinks that these things are not evil at all. That's just not. There's no part of the claim whatsoever. So notice a few things from this clip. One is he goes back and forth between these clips, between saying that evil makes it highly improbable that God doesn't exist, to saying that it would give us great pause, to saying that we have some reason to believe God doesn't exist. Those are not the same things.
Yeah.
And they're actually quite different than one another. And notice that the latter two do not entail the first one. You can have you can encounter things that can and should give you great pause in considering a thesis, and not lower the probability of that thesis very much. You can have some reason to doubt a thesis for which you have overwhelming reason to believe. And so I do think his epistemology is a little sloppy here, and that he should probably pick a conclusion of the problem of evil and stick with it rather than bouncing all over the place. Although I myself also like the term suffering better than the term evil, that's only because I think the species of evil that we call suffering is the one that is the most illuminating and the greatest challenge to theism. But this idea that like there's something, that they're distinct phenomena, that they're disjoint sets, is just not correct. And if we didn't assume that suffering was evil, then it wouldn't be evidence against the existence of God. Why would suffering count existence of God if it wasn't evil? I mean, the whole concept of God is, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. And so, with omnibenevolence really being the driving thing, why would a loving God allow suffering? Well, why wouldn't they if it's not evil? Like that's just a pointless. Right. That's just a pointless comment.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that kind of stood out to me from those series of statements was when he said, "Well, the burden is on any religious thing that believes person. If the person believes in God, the burden is on them to show why God would allow that." And first of all, like you pointed out, he's moving from evil to suffering, and the reason is because if sometimes the tactic, like Greg Koukl teaches, well, if the atheist posits evil, well, what's your standard for evil if you don't believe in a theistic God? And so moving to suffering. But of course, as you're pointing out, the suffering, it wouldn't be an argument if we weren't assuming a moral component to it, which was evil. And so to me, it's not just anybody who believes in a theistic God who has to explain suffering. It's any worldview. Krishna said that, well, it's part of the play. You're supposed to act out. If you're in an evil situation where you have to do something evil, just do it, because you have to play your part in the play that is the universe. Buddha struggled with suffering, and he said, well, you have to kill all your desires so that you don't suffer, because desires are the source of all evil. And an atheist would have to explain why we have a world of creatures who experience moral behaviors, and why there is that moral component to suffering. And so it's not just random creatures run around suffering, but there's a moral component to it, which is the whole argument against God.
Yeah, that's the only way to generate evidence against God is disvalue. I'm glad you brought up Krishna, because I don't, when people are talking about the problem of evil and Christianity, they obviously haven't read the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is absolutely scandalous. Like, you've got Arjuna, who's really distraught over the fact. Yeah, I mean, he's distraught over the idea that he might have to go to war, period, and kill people, but especially with family and friends. And so he seeks guidance from Krishna. What does Krishna do? Krishna says, doesn't matter. It's all fake. It's all Maya. So just, go through the motions. It doesn't matter. I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible. The Bhagavad Gita is moral garbage. It's trash. The book, who knows how much evil that book is justified. Now, I love Eastern literature. I like the more Buddhic and other Vedantic literature. I like the Dhammapada and a bunch of the Upanishads, and there's a lot of Eastern literature that I like a lot. But the Bhagavad Gita is terrible. Good Lord.
Yeah.
Because people talk about the Old Testament being terrible because God, seems to command genocide and whatnot. And well, if you have a certain view of the scriptures, then yeah, that would be pretty rough. But there's no getting out of what's going on in the Bhagavad Gita. There is no New Testament that updates the morality and expands the morality. It just is what it is, and it's terrible. This idea of the notion of the burden of proof, that the Christian has to demonstrate of all evils, of every instance of evil and suffering, that it's got a justification for it. That's absurd. Like, where else in life do we have to do it? Do Darwinists have to survey every observed phenomenon and demonstrate that it is consistent with or follows from or more probable on Darwinism as denial? I mean, this is just, again, he's completely naive of any kind of formal epistemology, or he couldn't say these things. And this is why I keep saying in these debates and interviews that it's epistemology really that's first philosophy, not metaphysics. because even in metaphysics, you got to know when something's proven and when it's not, and to what degree, and how to you got to understand the structure of justification, the structure of confirmation, in order to know how well confirmed your metaphysical theses are. And what I find just absolutely deplorably lacking in the atheist community, the internet atheist community, it's a complete, almost total vacuum of epistemology. Some of them are pretty decent at metaphysics, but it's almost a total vacuum when it comes to epistemology. And they need to get their ish together, because it's embarrassing.
Yeah, it's a great point. So let me
making it not a demonstration of evil at all, but instead a demonstration of justice or of necessity. This is what I'd really like to hear from Michael, not an explanation as to how free will is necessary and as a result of this humans inflict holocausts, but that when a mother is ripped from her child by a tsunami, this is not something to be thought of as bad, but something to be worth celebrating as an act of justice or a kind of suffering without which God could not conduct his plans properly. Still, it's worth considering the logical problem of evil and the issue of moral evil. You need to note that in order to hold that suffering is compatible with God, with a God who is morally perfect, you must hold the belief that this suffering is somehow necessary to obtain the optimal end. Right? Most commonly, this view is put forward by talking about human free will. If humans are to be what they're supposed to be.
Okay, so I want to stop real quick because I do think he's about to move into the argument from heaven, is there free will in heaven, and that's something I want to address on its own. But real quick, he kind of just like smuggled that in where, well, no, if the mother is suffering because of her child, this is to be celebrated because it can lead to good. And again, this is the same equivocation error that Dan Barker makes. Well, if the whole Holocaust could somehow lead to something good happening, I don't know, 1,000 years later, then the Holocaust itself must be good and should be celebrated. And it's like, no, that I'll let you take that way because I might be impolite here. I think that's very moronic to say.
It's pretty bad. It's pretty egregious for a number of reasons. One is because it's inherently a dumb view, and so it's a straw man because you're attributing a dumb view to somebody. Secondly, find me anybody of any stature that says such a thing. We just shouldn't be critiquing positions that nobody of any stature gives. It's pointless. I mean, I can dig up some idiot atheist meme and argue against it, but why would I bother? And I certainly wouldn't represent it as being typical, paradigmatic, or indicative of internet atheism generally, or at least, maybe I would, but maybe it is.
Depending.
Yeah, some days it sure seems like it, but yeah, no, nobody says that. Nobody says that. And it does, again, it shows that it seems to indicate to me that he's just got this hardcore utilitarian bent to him, to where he can't even get inside the mind of a virtue ethicist or other, constrained consequentialist. The mixed views that take into account both consequences and non-consequentialist aspects of morality. So he needs to do some more meta ethics, and that is an area where Christians have done really great work in meta ethics. There was one other thing about that clip that I wanted to say. Is it easy for you to play that clip again real quick?
I should be able to go back.
If it's the problem, don't worry about it. But if it's just a matter of clicking the button again.
I just don't know how far to take it back, but I think this might be good.
How free will is necessary, and as a result of this, humans inflict holocausts. But that when a mother is ripped from her child by a tsunami, this is not something to be thought of as bad, but something to be worth celebrating as an act of justice or a kind of suffering without which God could not conduct his plans.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, so this is something that's really important. So 2 things. I really recommend everybody read a paper by William Hasker called on regretting the evils of the past, or something like that. It's a fantastic paper, super interesting. I ended up directing a dissertation on that topic that was just absolutely fantastic. So I got to do a real deep dive into the concept. On regretting the evils of the past, You can post, maybe you can post it afterwards.
Okay,
But
yeah.
I really think Bill Hasker's work on evil is really, really good. And I think that paper in particular is super important because there's this, consider this statement by Kant. I mean, Kant is mostly unintelligible garbage, but he really says some interesting stuff every now and then. And when he surfaces for air and says something coherent, it's really typically pretty good. So think about his dictum that to will the end is to will the necessary means. I'm not even saying it's true. I'm just saying it's a really important thought because you say, well, gosh, I want to lose, I want to lose 30 pounds. And suppose while holding this goal before your mind, you're fully conscious that you need to stop eating so many donuts. Well, then to will losing 15 pounds, or I don't know if I said 15 or 30, you can edit that, is to will to not eat donuts. Now, we all recognize at the same time, boy, it'd be great. We know what I really, really want. What I really, really want, I'll tell you what I really, really want, is to
What
lose.
you really, really want?
Yeah, to lose 15 pounds and still eat donuts.
Yeah.
There's some sense in which there's this ideal that we know to be incoherent. Like, okay, well, I want to lose 15 pounds and I know I can't do that on donuts, so I guess I can't eat the donuts. That's the sort of consistency. While at the same time, we recognize, God, I mean, if there was somehow, even if it's a counter possible proposition, if only there were some way to have our cake and eat it too. If only there was some way to lose weight and eat the donuts. So now think about the idea of the ways in which the sufferings that we've gone through, the suffering that we've encountered, makes us who we are in a way that we reflectively endorse. Okay. Or maybe you have, I have had friends who've had children out of rape. I have a child from an out of wedlock relationship. And so on the one hand, you think, well, these are regrettable. But then on the other hand, you're like, I love this kid. I don't want to turn back the clock. And there's a certain inconsistency to that. Yeah, but it's an inconsistency we all recognize, and our axiology better be able to handle that. And so sometimes, it's like you see, I don't know, most of your viewers probably aren't old enough to remember MySpace, but there's this idea that like people will commonly say things like, my suffering made me who I am.
Yeah.
And they don't even necessarily draw the conclusion from that, but the conclusion's obvious. I wouldn't change it. And yeah, in some incoherent way, I wish I could be who I am because I like who I am. I endorse who I am. I like my perspective on the world. I value the wisdom that I gained through suffering and error. And I wouldn't give that up for anything. Like, not even to like not suffer. Well, no, actually I wouldn't. Even though we can simultaneously recognize that, wouldn't it be great if we could have this without the suffering? Wouldn't it be great if we could have our cake and eat it too, morally and existentially and phenomenologically? That would be great. But that's not how it is. And if a person comes to the point where, and as I believe all people eventually will, anybody of rationality and goodwill will eventually come to the point of self-acceptance, to where they're like, you know what, in some incoherent way, I wish I could have arrived at the same destination via a different route, but I fully endorse who I am, and I fully endorse where I've come, and I fully endorse what I've learned, and I would not turn back the clock. This is Viktor Frankl's attitude towards his time in the Holocaust, and man, did he suffer. If you read his account of losing his wife, it is crushing, just crushing. And yet he says, I wouldn't turn back the clock. This made me who I am. And I don't have the right to say that of other people. But the fact is, neither do atheists have the right to use the Holocaust, because this is your individual path in life. And And what God, and so let me just roll this into a related point that because it has to do with consequentialism as well. If you have a consequentialist morality, then you're going to judge the value of the world. You're going to judge what God has to do. You're going to judge what God has to do in terms of some sort of aggregate value in the world, and that's not the way to do it. If you're coming from the standpoint of God is love, then what needs to be the case is that everybody needs to have been loved by God. God cannot have treated anyone in an unloving manner, and it makes it personal and it makes it individual. Nobody suffers the sum total, and you heard him in one of the previous clips talk about the problem of evil being the evidential problem is more about the quantity of evil. Well, it doesn't actually matter what the quantity is because there's no such thing as the aggregate of suffering. Nobody suffers it. There is no individual who suffers the aggregate. What God, in a way, this is actually also strengthening the standards. And I can speak more to this if you want me to, but this actually tightens the standards on God. Every single individual must be such that their life is a good to them. It's a benefit to them, and God must not have ever been unloving to them in any way. They must end up in a place where you can say of them, God loved this person, and they had reason to believe God loved them in the end. And so, I think the whole meta-ethical picture that Cosmic Skeptic is working with is just that's what the problem is.
Yeah, and real quick, I did want to mention, I think Jordan Peterson, kind of some of the stuff he talks about gives us some insight into this. Just because he's saying, what are you going to say to the person who's suffering? Oh, don't suffer. It's actually a good thing that's happening. And that's really a perverse way to look at it. Because, Jordan Peterson talks about, the fundamental truth of life is that life is suffering and tragedy tainted by malevolence. Like, that's the most fundamental truth that everybody can recognize, right? Who's lived for more than 5 minutes. Then the secondary question is there a meaning in life that allows you to transcend that suffering, not in the sense that you escape the suffering, but that you can look at the suffering and say it's worth it? Or as you're pointing out, it made me who I am, so even though it sucks, I wouldn't change it because then I wouldn't be the same person I am now. And so that's it. You're not telling the person don't mourn. This is a good thing. But is there something deeper in life that, again, even on an atheistic worldview, you're going through this, but there's nothing deeper in life that allows you to grapple with it and say, oh, it's worth it because there's a deeper meaning in my life. Only on Christianity do you get anything like that. So it's not this perverse view of saying, well, actually celebrate the death of your loved one. It's saying, well, no, there's a deeper meaning in Christ, and that'll allow you to get through this and cope with it.
That's an excellent point and tie-in. Another great thing from Jordan Peterson is that he refuses to let people pretend like there exists anything corresponding to a group or class. There are no classes. They don't exist. You can't blame a race, for example, for anything because races don't exist. Nobody does that. It's only individuals that have rights. It's only individuals who have responsibilities. And what utopians. Hello. See you later. Hey, can you start tomorrow?
No, I go to work tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah,
how about Saturday?
48.
Okay. All right.
Friday,
okay. Monday?
I can work Saturday.
If you can work Monday, we'll talk.
Yeah, we'll talk.
What the hell was I saying?
Oh, you were making the point about Jordan Peterson talking about the no groups thing.
Yeah, so this idea, we've really got to get over the idea of this sort of collectivist thinking.
Yeah.
In a way, we just got to get away from any kind of collectivist thinking. It's individuals that God loves. It's individuals whom God has duties. It is individuals who have duties to God. It is individuals who make choices. It is individuals who make mistakes. It is individuals who make choices. It is individuals who in whom virtues inhere and vices inhere, and we got to get away from this collectivist aggregate. It's just a fiction.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Properly. Still, it's worth considering the logical problem of evil and the issue of moral evil. You need to note that in order to hold that suffering is compatible with God, with a God who is morally perfect, you must hold the belief that this suffering is somehow necessary to obtain the optimal end. Right? Most commonly, this view is put forward by talking about human free will. If humans are to be what they're supposed to be, free agents capable of freely choosing whether or not they love God, then they must be granted free will. This is a case that Michael makes in his hour-long video on the problem of evil. In order to do what's good, a person must have the capacity to do what's bad, the capability to do what's bad, and elect to do the opposite. If they're incapable of committing evil, they're essentially compelled to commit good. And committing a good action because you have no other choice to is not really committing a good action at all, but a robotic gesture of compulsion. This is a logical point. The absence of moral evil is incompatible with free will. And to answer this point, I have a question, which I've raised in a video before. Is there free will in heaven? Heaven is a place devoid of suffering, where nobody's killing anyone, no one's torturing anyone, no holocausts or wars are taking place. Yet presumably, unless heaven is the kind of robotic, compelled nature condemned by Michael, there must also be free will. If this is the case, then here we have an example of humans existing with free will, and yet there being no evil. Michael may wish to respond to this by saying that those in heaven still have a capacity for evil, but the very reason they're in heaven is because they're the kind of person who refuses to act upon it. But in order to hold this view, some things must be assumed. Firstly, that it's possible that evil can exist in heaven and can be committed in heaven. That is, though in practice nobody commits it, there's nothing logically preventing a holocaust from taking place in heaven. Now, you may just bite the bullet on this point and say, yeah, it's no problem because it's not going to happen in practice. But this is difficult for me to believe, that there's nothing logically preventing a Nazi Holocaust reoccurring in heaven. A possible escape to this might be to suggest that the people in heaven are so good, and the reason they're in heaven is because they're so good that it's psychologically impossible for them, essentially, to commit evil. But there are two problems with this. First, if it's really impossible for them to commit evil, then on Michael's own account, it's also impossible for them to be good, since to be good requires the capacity to be evil. If this is denied and it's asserted that it can be psychologically impossible for some people to commit evil, and yet then still being a free being in the relevant sense, then what we have, essentially, is proof, we have proof that God is capable of producing humans who somehow have free will and yet are still incapable of committing evil, even if just as a matter of psychological impossibility.
So I'm actually really excited to address this part because it's going once I think people understand this, it allows us to answer all the rest of the points he's going to make, kind of building on the assumptions he's made here. So it's kind of as you were pointing out before, it's like you can't get the loss of the 30 pounds and also eat the donuts, right? You can't get certain things without the loss. And so when he's assuming that there's going to be a state in heaven where people have free will but don't choose evil, well, guess what? You can't get that without having go through the life first and developing the certain virtues that put you in that state of mind first. And this is where I take the Tim Stratton route, which is I think there's at least three things. It's number one, we're going to see God for who he is, and we're not going to have like temptations to sin. We're not going to have the same corruptible nature that we've inherited from Adam and Eve. But most importantly, and again, this is going to bleed a lot into his other things, most importantly is we'll have seen and experienced the tragedy and suffering that can come from making the wrong choices with our free will. And so I think heaven, once we get to that state, and I do just disagree with Michael Jones' statement, I don't think that there's suffering and evil in heaven. But what was the point I was making? Right. But we're going to see, like when he gets into the MLK example, once we see the suffering and the depravity and all of the terrible evil that can come from using our free will for evil, and we get to heaven in a place where we now won't take that state of affairs for granted, plus the non-corruptible nature, plus the being able to enjoy God and fellowship with him. Yeah, that's the reason I don't think that there's a sin in heaven, even though there's free will. But again, as you point out, you can't get that unless you've gone through the life and experienced the suffering first.
No, I think that's exactly right. I want to actually pick on some points in the at the beginning of the clip before, and so we can end on that. I just can't pass them over though. So yeah, he talks about every evil. The theist must demonstrate that each instance of suffering is necessary for some optimal state. So first of all, no. The theist doesn't have to demonstrate any of these things. the theist, if the theist has good evidence for theism, they can also just deduce that these things are the case, by the way. But the idea that any position has some sort of obligation to demonstrate that every observed fact, like fits with their theory. Why didn't I get invited? My kids are going country dancing without me. I just got a new cowboy shirt too.
How rude. Well,
It's rude, straight up rude. So that's that bad epistemology again. Also, it's not about any optimal state. There is no optimal state. There is no best of all possible. There's no token best of all possible worlds. The issue is not whether something is necessary for the best, because there is no best. The question is whether something is necessary for something sufficiently good, something that is worth doing. And this is what I don't understand about. So, a lot of Christians miss this point too, and they buy into the idea that it's got to be an optimal state or the only possible way, or that things have to be the same way all the time. All that is required of any observed state is that it is relevantly connected to some sufficiently good end, outcome, or intent. Okay, so there are lots of things we do because they're worth doing. They're not necessary for the best, but they're worth doing. And some kinds of suffering, or providing people with opportunities to display virtues, is often worth doing. It doesn't have to be the best possible state. But it does have to be necessary in the sense that God can't permit something. What's necessary, God can't permit something without it being connected to some general end. Okay, so
right.
It's not as if each individual instance of evil has to have a reason for it. There has to be a reason for a system in which evils can occur. I think that God does roll dice. I think there is chance and chaos in the world, and I think God has good reason for setting a system in order with natural laws and letting things somewhat take a course, and that will sometimes mean people come into conflict with other rigid objects in the flux of physics. I think God's got good reasons for doing that, and that's the issue is. I think God has good reasons for doing it, and they're motivated by love. That's the standard. If somebody wants to push me off my theism, well, then they got to demonstrate to me that I don't have reason to believe that. It's just the burden of proof stuff really kind of takes me off. So and this is relevant to the issue of heaven because let's distinguish between two types of free will. There's the kind of free will that is sometimes called the PAP view, PAP, Principle of Alternative Possibilities.
Yeah.
So that's one kind of free will, the ability to choose one option over another. But then there's a higher level of free will too that we might call guidance control. And this is where you reflectively endorse the good, you will the good. So think about God. God doesn't actually have, in a lot of ways, the same kind of free will we have because he doesn't face choices between good and evil. But God is free in the higher sense that he joins his will to good. He reflectively joins his will to the good. And that is something that we hopefully get to. And even if the sort of principle of alternative possibilities free will is good, is necessary for certain goods at certain times, it might be only good for a stage. I mean, think of all the ways in which certain aspects of life we could say are good for a time, and then we go do something else. But it's also good for a time, right? So this idea that because libertarian free will is a good, a great good, for the sake of which God is justified in letting us run amok. That doesn't mean that that's like the only good. Like that's what drives me crazy. It's like that's the only. Nobody says that's the only good. They say it's a good, and you can achieve the good for which it is aimed, namely virtue, which are habits, inclinations, dispositions, so that once you get these dispositions deeply enough ingrained, they become things that you don't or even can't act contrary to, but you don't want to.
Right.
And that's a higher state of divine state of being. So it's just so naive and shallow to think there's only one kind of freedom that matters, or that any kind of greater good that is sufficient to justify the permission of certain instances of suffering thereby have to be enshrined in perpetuity. It's a non sequitur. Nothing suggests that at all.
Yeah.
Nothing suggests that at all. So when you get to heaven, there are other, even greater good to be achieved. There are even better states to be achieved, and they can be achieved partially in virtue of what we did with our libertarian free will, namely develop virtues, hopefully, and eventually strong enough to be dispositions contrary to which we will never act.
Yeah. So as I get this in play, I don't know where the microphone on your phone is. It sounds like something might be banging it or rubbing it. Or it might just be the internet. I don't know.
I just got to 10% power, and I think my phone doesn't function as well once it's
down to like 10%. That probably explains it.
We may have to wrap her up.
Okay. Well, that's okay. Yeah, maybe we can do a part 2 where we go through some more of the clips. I guess in wrapping it up, what I want to say is he'll get basically his world cosmic skeptic one, and he'll outline this. And he says that there's an argument that gave him pause, which is think of some of your heroes like Martin Luther King. Well, who would they be without the suffering? They wouldn't be a hero without the suffering because they wouldn't develop the virtues. And Cosmic Skeptic essentially argues that he would prefer a world in which, and he used the example of Martin Luther King, in which there wasn't racism, there wasn't the evil. And then, yeah, Martin Luther King wouldn't be a hero, he wouldn't have developed the virtues, but there wouldn't have been the suffering in the first place. It would just be kind of this generic pleasure. That seems to kind of be his preferable world. And I would say a bunch of things to that is, number one, is this whole argument is the argument we just made of what makes free will in heaven but no sin possible, which is that we experience racism, we know the evils of racism, and then we don't take the experience of no racism for granted in heaven. And so that's one of the things that leads to us not making stupid decisions later that can lead to these things. So we have to see where the evil first in order to develop the virtue. And so then when he describes his kind of world, I was trying to think of a good kind of illustration. And I've worked in a daycare for almost 10 years now, so I know how kids are of all ages, right? And so I was thinking the kind of world that Cosmic Skeptic wants, where he says, there's no evil, so there's no virtues, but that's okay because I prefer just kind of pleasure, no virtues, and no evil. Well, I thought that'd be kind of like if I had a classroom of, say, 10 2-year-olds and say they were never, ever going to grow or age beyond 2. They were just going to be 2 forever. And so it was my responsibility to, and so say maybe it's kind of pointless for me to put certain structures of discipline in place, or it would be unimportant for me to teach them certain things that would lead to developing virtues later. Well, you can say, well, okay, so they don't suffer as much, but it's like, it's such a shallow existence. And that's kind of the mentality he has for humans. If there's no overcoming suffering and adversity and developing virtues, it's just we just stay inherently selfish and just weary of pleasure all of the time. We'd be such shallow creatures. And so it seems to me that God is no less loving for running a world in which we're mature creatures who have developed virtues and make legitimate choices and have a genuine relationship with him, than us just be kind of these immature, ultimately selfish, shallow, virtuous creatures. It just, I don't see why that kind of world would be preferable at all. And it would be totally antithetical to the whole purpose God even created us for anyway, which is to have a mature and meaningful relationship with him.
No, I think you're dead right. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're dead right. The person who really turned me onto this way of thought is John Hick, author of Evil and a God of Love, especially in his book, his little book called Philosophy of Religion, his introduction. That this, and Swinburne picks this up really well too. The Garden of Delights picture of the world is it's morally shallow. It's morally shallow. And I think Cosmic Skeptic is just tone deaf. I think he's tone deaf to the Lord of the Rings points. I think he's tone deaf to the goodness of the intellectual virtues. He continually seems to think that that intellectual and moral virtues are just not that big a deal. Whereas, so like Richard Swinburne always says, life is not about what happens to you; it's about what you do with it. And the Jordan Peterson quote about it's not about happiness; it's about meaning. And there's an oatmeal cartoon. The oatmeal is a really great cartoon strip, and it's got one called One Against the Idea of Happiness, and it's amazing. It's very, very profound. And look, I have the option of that kind of life. I've got the option to live a life of like worldly bliss. I've got everything I need. I've got position, power, money. I could basically do whatever I wanted. That does not seem attractive to me, and isn't that interesting that even when we have the ability to have that kind of life, we don't even choose it. But what do? We always seem to choose these paths that cause us to suffer more because we think that who we become is more important. And what do we think about people? How do we judge people who choose to live these lives that these atheists portray as what God is supposed to give us? Like a guy like Trump. Like, do we think, oh yeah, Trump's a world full of Trumps is great? A guy that just kind of never has any trouble and seems to fall backwards into success at every, money, women, fame, no consequences. Is that what we want? That's what the world that God is supposed to give us. And then at the same time, they're like, God can't exist because there's a Trump. You can't have it both ways. Look at real life. Look at who in the world thinks their own existence is worth something. Think about who's depressed and who has a sense of meaning and purpose. And it has nothing to do with a life of ease and pleasure and not suffering. In fact, it turns out to be the opposite for the most part. Again, to take it back to Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, the people who consider their lives meaningful you can't draw any correlation between that and absence of suffering. On the contrary, suffering seems to be an essential detail in that experience. And so this idea that like we take what we know about real life and toss it out the window when we start to do theology, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. You can't do that and expect anybody to respect the results.
Yeah. And speaking of Jordan Peterson, I think he's quoting Dostoevsky, if I'm not mistaken. Dostoevsky is making the critique of, pardon?
I said Peterson really loves Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah, him too. And specifically always quotes somebody that says, criticizes the utopia vision of the world, and says if you gave humans nothing but, enough to eat and drink and nothing more to do than busy themselves with the continuation of the species, smash everything to bits just so something new would happen and never even survive. So it's just things are in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So wrap this up. I brought the banner. So Trent Dougherty's YouTube channel, Recovering Reason. I'll put a link to that in the description. Also, I think you mentioned a paper and article earlier. So when you send it to me, I'll add that to the description. So yeah, this has been a great episode. I guess you have a summary thought for me.
I can barely hear you now. It's either my speaker or your mic. I don't know, but you're coming through really fuzzy to me right now.
Okay, well, so I guess, yeah, maybe we'll wrap it up if you can hear me, and then we'll continue talking offline. But so, I don't know if you can hear me. I do want to thank you very much for being here. Pardon?
I'd love to do a part 2.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, we'll do a part 2. We'll get through some of the other clips. So people look out for that. We'll plan that. And until next time, Trent Dougherty, thank you so much for being here, brother. And we'll do it again soon.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.